In this video, we are going to introduce the deployment of the IBM Spectrum Accelerate system via two different methods. Before attempting deployment, please download the latest IBM Spectrum Accelerate Planning, Deployment, and Operation Guide. Refer to Chapter 2, Requirements, Planning, and Best Practices to help you prepare your physical servers with the VMware vSphere hypervisor. Each server needs to be configured with one data store and 1 to 3 port groups and 1 to 3 virtual switches. It is recommended that you configure your vSwitch or vSwitches with multiple physical Ethernet connections for fault tolerance and performance. Please be advised that the interconnect and iSCSI networks must consist of a minimum of one 10 gigabit Ethernet connection and must support an end-to-end MTU of at least 9,000 bytes. For the deployment workstation, if you wish to use the GUI to deploy the IBM Spectrum Accelerate system, you should be running a 64-bit version of Microsoft Windows. If you wish to use the command line deployment script to deploy the IBM Spectrum Accelerate system, you should be running a 64-bit version of Red Hat or Ubuntu Linux. First, we will demonstrate how to deploy IBM Spectrum Accelerate through the GUI. We are going to deploy a 3-module system. All of the required information has been listed in the table. We will cover more details while in the deployment wizard. The XIV GUI 4.5 is required to deploy IBM Spectrum Accelerate through the GUI. The deployment package should be downloaded onto the Microsoft Windows workstation and will need to be extracted. Open the XIV GUI, click System, then Deploy IBM Spectrum Accelerate, and the deployment wizard will appear. We will need to navigate to a deployment executable file inside the extracted deployment package. Once the correct file is selected, it will show the system version we are going to deploy. If we have an existing deployment configuration, we can import our settings from this file. This is especially useful in environments where you are redeploying the same or similar systems multiple times. In our case, we do not have an existing configuration file, so we will skip this step. Click on the System Settings tab. We need to fill in the required information. System name, what we want to call this system. IBM Customer Number, or ICN. This is a 7-digit customer identification number provided by IBM. Proper configuration of the ICN will help with the future support of your environment. If you do not already have your ICN, please contact IBM to obtain one. Management Gateway and Management NetMask. This is the IP version 4 information for storage management interfaces. This will be used to connect the management GUI and XCOI to the IBM Spectrum Accelerate system after successful deployment. Interconnect MTU. A 9,000 byte MTU is required for performance reasons. Off-premises. If the system is installed in a local VMware vSphere hypervisor environment, select No. If it's being deployed to a remote cloud-based environment, then select Yes. Here we are selecting No. Run diagnostics. When enabled, it will provide a boot sequence analysis for the network environment and disk performance during the deployment. Here we will select No. The next tab is vCenter Settings. If the VMware vSphere hypervisor servers are managed by a VMware vCenter, then you must enable this setting and provide the appropriate vCenter hostname or IP address and login credentials, as well as a data center name. In our demo, the VMware vSphere hypervisor servers are not managed by a VMware vCenter, and we will leave this setting disabled. The next tab is Module Settings. First, we'll need to set the shared configuration for all modules. Memory for every module must be between 24 and 48 gigabytes. Our configuration will use 24 gigabytes. Each module can support between 6 and 12 disks. Our configuration will use 11 disks. Each module can support up to one solid-state drive, or SSD. Our configuration will not use an SSD. For optimal performance, we will use RDM disks, and we'll leave the Use Virtual Disks option disabled. Additional settings for each module needs to be configured independently. To add the module-specific configuration, click the plus symbol to add a module. In the Add Module dialog, we will need to provide the following information: data store name, vSphere hypervisor or ESXi hostname or IP address, vSphere hypervisor or ESXi login credentials, vSphere hypervisor network port group names. We can use different port groups for different types of traffic, or share the port group. Port groups can be configured to be on a specific VLAN for network management purposes. For interconnect settings, you'll need to provide the IPv4 address and netmask you wish to use for the interconnect network. This network is private to a specific IBM Spectrum Accelerate deployment and does not need to be routable through your overall network. Click Add to confirm the configuration of this module. Additional modules are added using the same process. The wizard will attempt to provide reasonable default configurations for your additional modules based on the configuration of the first module. Please confirm these default configurations are correct and adjust them as needed for your environment. Sequential IP addressing is useful from a support and troubleshooting perspective, but is not required. The next tab is for proactive support. IBM Proactive Support provides information to IBM to assist in supporting your IBM Spectrum Accelerate environment. Proactive support requires configuration of an SMTP or email server to relay system events to IBM. We highly recommend customers take advantage of this capability by configuring proactive support. Input your SMTP gateway and the primary customer contact information. All of the information needed for the deployment has been entered. We will click Deploy to start the system deployment. The time for this deployment is dependent on your network connectivity and how many modules you're configuring. For this example, it's a 3-module system and will require approximately 10 minutes. For the purposes of this video, we will skip ahead in the process. The IBM Spectrum Accelerate system deployment has completed successfully. You can click Show Log to check the deployment logs, or click Export Configurations to save the XML configuration for future use. We will click OK, and our new system will automatically open in the Management GUI. For security reasons, it will ask you to change the default password for the user admin. You can change it now or change it later. The default password is admin. Looking at the system, we can see the deployed system is a 3-module system with 11 disks and 2 iSCSI interfaces. We can create pools, volumes, and iSCSI port configurations to start using the system. We will now show the deployment of another IBM Spectrum Accelerator system, this time using a Linux deployment host. As we talked about earlier, the deployment host should be a 64-bit Red Hat or Ubuntu Linux system. For this deployment, we'll use an Ubuntu Linux system with the IBM Spectrum Accelerate Linux deployment package. The Linux deployment package is a self-extracting bash script. Running the script with the -H option will display the usage information for the script. The -C option is used to specify the XML configuration file, and the -V option will run the deployment script in verbose mode, which will provide additional progress information during the deployment. The -F option will automatically delete existing virtual machines which have the same name as your new virtual modules specified in the XML configuration. Please be careful with this option, as it will cause the loss of any data that existed on the virtual machines being deleted. The -E option can be used to extract the example XML configuration. We are going to run the script with the -E option. This will give us an example configuration file which we can modify to meet the configuration requirements for our deployment. Now we have an SDS machine template.xml file. If we open it in a text editor, we can see all of the parameters which we inputted into a GUI wizard. The name of the system, virtual machine network information, how many disks, how many SSDs, the amount of memory. We also have the option to use the VMware vCenter. Additionally, the module-specific configurations for each ESXi host and each module. We will make a copy of this template and update it with our information for our deployment. We now have a fully customized configuration file for our deployment. We are going to run the deployment script in verbose mode and specify our XML configuration file. The deployment will start by untarring the package and then configure each vSphere hypervisor host, followed by copying the template virtual machine to each host. After the virtual machines have been deployed, the script will add disks in each module and then power on all of the modules. At the end of the deployment process, we'll now have a functional IBM Spectrum Accelerate system. Please note that at the end of the deployment, it will generate a system UUID or Universal Unique Identifier to identify the specific system. We can now add this newly deployed system into our GUI for management. Specify the 3 management IP addresses, the GUI will also ask you to change the default password for the admin user. Click the newly added system, and we can see that it's a 3-module system with 11 2TB disks in each module. We can create pools, volumes, and iSCSI port configurations to start using the system. Thank you for watching this demonstration of the IBM Spectrum Accelerate deployment process.